As the rain soaked through my dress, Julian pushed me out of the car. I was 9 months pregnant, clutching my stomach in pain, while he screamed that my labor would ruin his leather seats and his parents' vacation. He didn't know that as the car sped away, I wasn't just losing a husband. I was starting the final audit of his life. Before I begin the story, please hit that like button and let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. Your kindness means so much to me. Now, let's listen to my story. Eleanor, if you ruin these custom Napa leather seats with your fluids, I swear to God, the detailing bill is coming out of your personal allowance, Julian snapped, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel of the brand new Mercedes. The rhythmic slap of the windshield wipers against the Connecticut downpour was the only other sound in the cabin, a sharp clinical contrast to the low, guttural moan that escaped my lips. Another contraction hit, a white-hot wave of agony that made the world blur. But Julian didn't reach for my hand. He didn't even glance away from the road. His only concern was the pristine interior of a car that I had technically paid for with the last of my inheritance. The investment I'd made into his image as the rising star of the Beaumont legacy. We were supposed to be heading to the Hamptons for his parents' annual summer gala, a weekend of forced smiles and expensive gin, but my daughter had decided that 38 weeks was quite long enough. I watched him through a haze of pain, observing the sharp line of his jaw and the expensive wool of his blazer, realizing with a terrifying icy clarity that the man I had spent 15 years building was nothing more than a hollow shell of greed. He wasn't a husband. He was a project that had gone into deep, irrecoverable debt. Julian, I'm in active labor, I managed to whisper, my voice trembling not from fear, but from the sheer effort of containing the scream that wanted to tear through my throat. We need to turn around, now. The hospital is 20 minutes back. He let out a sharp, derisive laugh, a sound so cold it felt like a physical blow. And miss the opening toast? My father has the CEO of the firm coming tonight, Eleanor. Do you have any idea what this promotion means for us? For the Beaumont name? You're being hysterical. It's probably just Braxton Hicks. You've always had a flair for the dramatic when the spotlight isn't on you. The cruelty of his words didn't sting as much as the realization of his utter indifference to the life kicking violently inside me. This was the American dream he preached about, the self-made man who had pulled himself up by his bootstraps, conveniently forgetting that I was the one who had tied the laces and bought the boots. Suddenly, the car swerved toward the shoulder, the tires screeching against the wet asphalt as Julian slammed on the brakes. He didn't look at me as he leaned across the console, his face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated annoyance. Out, he barked, the word hitting me like a stone. I blinked, the rain blurring my vision as it lashed against the window. What? I asked, the word barely a breath. I said, get out, Eleanor, he repeated, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous hiss. You want to play the martyr? Fine. Do it on the side of the road. I am not arriving at my parents' estate with a screaming woman and a ruined car. I'll call you an Uber when I get to the next exit. If you're lucky, they might have a plastic sheet for you to sit on. Before I could even process the absurdity of his demand, he was around the car, hauling the passenger door open. The freezing Connecticut rain rushed in, soaking my hair and my thin maternity dress in seconds. With a strength that was both clinical and brutal, he gripped my arm and pulled. I stumbled out onto the muddy embankment, the gravel biting into my palms as I fell to my knees. Another contraction seized my body, pinning me to the earth, while Julian reached into the back seat and grabbed the designer diaper bag, the one his mother had mocked for being too practical. He didn't set it down. He tossed it into the mud beside me, a final gesture of contempt for the life we were supposed to be starting together. "Enjoy the rain, Eleanor. Maybe it'll wash off some of that self-pity," he sneered, before slamming the door shut. I stayed there, my hands sinking into the cold gray silt of the roadside, watching as the red glow of his taillights began to fade into the gray curtain of the storm. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the roar of the rain and the rhythmic thrum of the life within me. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. The heat of my rage was the only thing keeping me from shivering. I reached out, my fingers brushing the mud-stained fabric of the baby bag, and I felt a strange, terrifying sense of peace wash over me. The silence of the abyss had finally reached its bottom, and there was nowhere to go but up. As the last glimmer of Julian's Mercedes disappeared around a bend, I looked at the empty road and felt the first stirrings of a plan. A cold, calculated audit of a marriage that was now officially bankrupt. I leaned my head back, letting the rain wash over my face, and whispered into the dark. "Julian, you just lost the only insurance check of your life." As the cold Connecticut mud seeped into my skin, the physical chill was nothing compared to the icy realization of how much I had truly invested in a bankrupt man. My mind, trained for decades to find the patterns in chaos, involuntarily drifted back 15 years to a cramped, sun-drenched apartment in Manhattan, a time when the American dream still felt like a promise rather than a predatory loan. Back then, I wasn't just Julian Beaumont's wife. I was Eleanor Vance, the youngest senior financial editor at the city's most prestigious trade journal. I was the one who could spot a subprime mortgage crisis from a mile away. Yet I had been utterly blind to the toxic assets accumulating in my own living room. I remember the nights we spent hunched over our shared desk, the air thick with the smell of cheap takeout and Julian's mounting desperation. He had been a mid-level analyst then, drowning in a series of rookie mistakes that threatened to end his career before it even began. "Eleanor, please," he would whisper, his eyes wild with the fear of failure. "Just look over this one report. My father will never let me hear the end of it if I lose this client." And so I did. I stayed up until dawn, rewriting his clumsy prose into sharp, authoritative analysis, scrubbed his data until it shone, and essentially ghost-wrote the very reputation he would later use to dismiss me. I told myself it was an investment in our future, a collaborative effort to build a legacy. I didn't realize I was merely providing the scaffolding for a statue that intended to crush me. We lived by the creed of the silent generation, the belief that hard work and quiet sacrifice were the keys to the kingdom. I took pride in our frugality. While my colleagues were buying designer bags to celebrate their promotions, I was hunting for coupons and mending my own coats so that Julian could have the $3,000 bespoke suits he insisted were essential equipment for the boardroom. I remember one winter, I wore the same pair of boots until the soles were paper thin, just so we could afford the private club membership his father demanded he maintain. "We're building something, Elle," he'd say, flashing that charismatic smile that I now realize was just a well-maintained facade. "Once I'm partner, you'll never have to worry about a cent again." It was the ultimate carrot on a stick, and I followed it with the disciplined devotion of a woman who believed that self-reliance meant carrying the weight of two people on one pair of shoulders. The cracks in our golden vault didn't appear all at once. They were hairline fractures I chose to ignore out of a misplaced sense of loyalty. There were the business trips that lasted a day too long, the credit card statements for high-end boutiques that I never shopped at, and the way his mother, Martha, would look at me with a mixture of pity and condescension. Martha Beaumont believed that the family's wealth was a divine right, a legacy to be protected from outsiders like me, regardless of who was actually generating the income. I endured her snide remarks about my pedestrian tastes because I thought I was part of the inner circle. I thought our joint account was a symbol of our unity, a shared reservoir for our daughter's future and our own quiet retirement. The illusion finally shattered on a Tuesday afternoon, the very day I had planned to surprise Julian with the news of my pregnancy. I was reconciling our monthly statements, a habit of a professional editor that Julian always mocked as obsessive, when I saw it. A wire transfer of $50,000. It hadn't gone to a mortgage payment or an investment fund. It had been moved from our emergency savings directly into a private account held in Martha Beaumont's name. My heart had thudded in my chest as I stared at the digital trail of my own stolen labor. When I confronted him that night, Julian hadn't even looked up from his scotch. "It's a family matter, Eleanor," he had said with that patronizing lilt he'd perfected. "My mother needed to bridge a gap for the new estate in the Hamptons. Besides, it's not like you're actually working right now. You should be grateful we have the Beaumont name to fall back on." Standing now in the rain, 15 years later, the memory of that moment burned hotter than the contractions. I realized then what I hadn't dared to admit in that Manhattan apartment. I wasn't his partner. I was his interest-free loan. I had spent a decade and a half editing his life into a masterpiece, only for him to try and delete the author the moment the manuscript was finished. The man who had just left me for dead in the mud was the same man who had been slowly bleeding me dry since the day we said "I do." But Julian had made a fatal error in his calculations. He had forgotten that a woman who knows how to balance a ledger also knows how to identify a total loss and how to write it off with surgical precision. The memory of that $50,000 betrayal was just the opening entry in a long ledger of Julian's hypocrisy. As I huddled by the roadside, the rain stripping away the last of my warmth, I couldn't help but recall the countless dinner parties where Julian would hold court, swirling a 20-year-old scotch and preaching the gospel of the self-made man. He loved the phrase, "pull yourself up by your bootstraps," often using it like a blunt instrument to silence anyone who suggested that luck or legacy played a role in success. He would lean back, his eyes catching the light of the chandelier, and gesture vaguely toward me with a pitying smile. "Eleanor's the heart of our home," he'd say to the captive audience of board members and their wives. "But she's lived a very sheltered life. She doesn't quite grasp the grit required to survive in the real market. She's lucky she has the Beaumont name to protect her from the cold winds of reality." The irony was so thick it was a wonder he didn't choke on it. The real market he spoke of was a battlefield I had mapped for him every single night at our kitchen table. In those private hours, The self-made man was a frantic, sweating mess who couldn't balance a spreadsheet without my intervention. He would bring home drafts of his quarterly reports, claiming they just needed a quick polish from a professional editor's eye. But as I dove into the numbers, my financial editor's intuition, honed by years of deconstructing corporate lies, would scream at me. These weren't just errors. They were deliberate obfuscations. He was cooking the books, shifting liabilities into shell accounts, and inflating assets to meet the impossible expectations of his father and the firm. I was no longer just his wife or his editor. I had become his unwitting accomplice, the ghostwriter of a fraudulent success story. I remember one night looking at a particularly creative piece of accounting he'd asked me to streamline, and realizing that Julian didn't actually have an ounce of the talent he bragged about. He wasn't a shark. He was a pilot fish, feeding off the scraps of my intellect while convincing the world he was the one doing the hunting. Despite his utter reliance on my skills, Julian's public narrative of my dependency grew more aggressive. It was a calculated psychological tactic, a way to devalue the very asset he was exploiting so that I would never realize my own market price. He wanted me to feel small, to believe that without the Beaumont shield, I was a parasite who would wither in the sun. This sentiment was echoed like a poisonous refrain by my mother-in-law, Martha. She would call me on Tuesday mornings, the correction days, as I began to call them, to remind me of my place in their hierarchy. "Eleanor, dear," she would purr, her voice like silk wrapped around a razor. "I hope you're showing Julian the proper gratitude. He carries such a heavy burden for this family. A woman in your position should be grateful she doesn't have to face the self-reliance Julian practices every day." The last of those calls had happened just hours before we left for this disastrous trip, while I was sitting in my nursery-to-be, clutching a folder of Julian's secret debts that I had finally managed to compile. While Martha lectured me on gratitude, I was looking at a series of high-interest personal loans Julian had taken out in my name, forgeries that leveraged my pristine credit to fund his parents' extravagant lifestyle and his own failing investments. He had preached self-reliance while secretly cannibalizing my future to keep his own house of cards from collapsing. I had sat there, listening to Martha's condescending tone, and realized that the Beaumonts weren't a dynasty. They were a pyramid scheme, and I was the foundational victim. Now, as the Connecticut wind howled, the memory of Martha's voice merged with the roar of the storm. Julian had truly believed his own lies. He thought that by throwing me out of his car, he was finally shedding the dead weight of a dependent wife. He was so blinded by his own arrogance that he failed to see the danger. He hadn't just abandoned his pregnant wife. He had discarded the only person who knew where all the bodies were buried, and the person who had kept the shovel hidden for 15 years. I reached into the mud, my fingers closing around the cold, wet handle of my bag, where the digital copies of those forged loans and cooked reports were stored. Julian wanted self-reliance? Fine. I was about to show him exactly how much it costs to stand on your own 2 feet when the ground beneath you has been liquidated. The red taillights of Julian's car vanished, leaving me in a world that was nothing but gray water and the rhythmic, agonizing pressure of my daughter's arrival. I didn't pray for a miracle. I looked for a solution, crawling toward the dim glow of a gas station overhang a few yards down the road. That was where the black SUV found me. Not a police cruiser, but a vehicle that radiated the kind of quiet, old-money power the Beaumonts only pretended to possess. The woman who stepped out into the deluge didn't scream or panic. She moved with the practiced calm of someone who had navigated many storms. It was Clara Sterling, the wife of the chairman at Julian's firm, a woman whose name was spoken in hushed, respectful tones in every boardroom in Manhattan. As she draped her cashmere coat over my shivering shoulders and helped me into the back seat, our eyes met in the rearview mirror. She didn't see a victim. She saw a casualty of a war she knew all too well. "Don't speak, Eleanor," she whispered, her voice a steady anchor against the howling wind. "We're going to the hospital. Everything else can wait." 3 hours later, in the sterile, quiet sanctuary of a private maternity wing, the world changed. My daughter was asleep in a glass bassinet, a tiny, perfect defiance of her father's cruelty, and Clara was sitting by my bed, sipping tea that had gone cold. The silence of the abyss had been replaced by a sharp, clinical focus. "He left you on the road," Clara said, her voice devoid of judgment but heavy with a shared understanding of the men in our world. I leaned back against the pillows, the physical pain of the birth receding behind the cold fire of my resolve. "He didn't just leave me, Clara," I said, my voice sounding like the snap of a dry branch. "He left his only chance at a clean audit. Julian is a fraud. He's been moving company liabilities into personal shell accounts for years to cover the losses his father's investors created. I know, because I'm the one who's been editing the lies to make them look like profits." I saw the flicker of interest in Clara's eyes, the intellectual satisfaction of a woman who had spent decades watching the self-made men around her fail upwards. I didn't ask for pity. I gave her a summary. I described the specific inconsistencies in the Q3 reports, the way Julian had used my personal credit to bridge the gaps in his parents' dwindling estate, and the forged signatures he thought I'd never notice. Clara listened with the intensity of a grand master watching a chess match. She knew her husband, the chairman, had been suspicious of the Beaumont's sudden miracle turnarounds, but he lacked the internal key to unlock the vault. I was that key. "I've spent 15 years being a ghost," I told her, my fingers tightening around the edge of the hospital blanket. "I gave up a career at the Journal to build his, and he tried to liquidate me like a bad debt. I'm not interested in a messy public divorce that leaves my daughter with nothing but a ruined name." Clara reached out and took my hand, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so refined. There was a silent pact forming under the hum of the hospital's fluorescent lights, a union of two women who understood that in the world of high finance and deep legacies, the loudest voice isn't the one that wins. It's the one that holds the most accurate ledger. "My husband is looking for a reason to clean house before the merger," Clara said softly, a sharp, predatory smile touching her lips. "And Julian has just handed him the broom. What do you want, Eleanor?" I looked over at my daughter, her tiny chest rising and falling in the darkness, and I felt a surge of the matriarch energy I had suppressed for far too long. "I don't want revenge," I whispered, the words tasting like copper and salt. "I want the life I earned. I want every cent Julian stole from my inheritance, every bit of equity he siphoned into his parents' home. And I want the Beaumont name to mean absolutely nothing by the time my daughter takes her first steps. I want justice, and I want it with interest." Clara nodded, a grim, satisfied movement. "Then we have work to do," she said, standing up and smoothing her skirt. Julian thinks you're broken and alone in the rain. Let him believe it. Let him go to the Hamptons and play the hero for his father. While he's celebrating his self-made success, we will be conducting a quiet, thorough autopsy of his career. As she walked toward the door, I felt the first real spark of hope, not the desperate hope of a wife, but the cold, calculating hope of a professional who had finally found a worthy partner. I wasn't just a mother or a discarded spouse anymore. I was a specialist. And Julian was about to learn that the most dangerous person to leave behind is the one who knows exactly how much you're truly worth. Looking at my newborn baby while my husband was laughing at a resort, I realized that family isn't always about blood. It's about who stays when the storm hits. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you sacrificed everything for? How did you find the strength to stand up? Please let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like this video to support my journey. Now, back to how I prepared my final move. When Julian picked me up from the hospital 3 days later, he didn't bring flowers. He brought a list of logistical adjustments for the upcoming gala. He treated my abandonment on that rain-slicked road as a regrettable but ultimately necessary management decision, a minor glitch in his otherwise pristine timeline. "I'm glad you've regained your senses, Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying that familiar, patronizing lilt as he adjusted the mirror of the Mercedes, the very seats I had supposedly been a threat to. I didn't argue. I didn't even look at him. I sat in the passenger seat, cradling our daughter Lily, and adopted the silence of the abyss. I let him believe the light in my eyes had been extinguished by the storm, that I was now nothing more than a defeated, postpartum shadow of the woman I used to be. He needed to believe I was broken, so he would stop looking at me. And Julian, in his infinite arrogance, was all too happy to accept that he had finally broken his dependent wife. Once we were back in our Greenwich home, the role play became my primary occupation. By day, I was the weary mother, moving with a deliberate sluggishness, offering Julian the vague, watery smiles of a woman who had lost her edge. I let Martha Beaumont lecture me on the virtues of sacrifice, nodding submissively while she bragged about the new Hamptons villa they were finally finalizing. But when the clock struck midnight and the house fell into a heavy, expensive silence, the invisible observer took over. I would slip out of bed, leaving Julian snoring in his self-importance, and retreat to the home office. The soft glow of the monitor was the only light as I began the audit in the shadows, a cold, clinical autopsy of our 15-year marriage. Using the forensic accounting skills I had honed as a financial editor, I began to peel back the layers of Julian's self-made legacy. Every night was a deep dive into the digital underworld of his embezzlement. I recovered deleted spreadsheets, traced obscure wire transfers to offshore accounts, and cross-referenced his business expenses with the actual growth of his parents' estate. It was intellectual ASMR for a woman who had been told she didn't understand the real market. I found the receipts for everything: the forged signatures on my inheritance waivers, the siphoning of my personal savings to cover his father's bad bets, and the systematic inflation of his firm's Q3 assets to secure his promotion. My focus was absolute. Every discovered irregularity was a brick in the wall of my future freedom. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a strategist, calculating the exact moment of a hostile takeover. There was a moment around 3 a.m. on the fifth night when the floorboards groaned behind me. I felt a jolt of pure adrenaline, the roller coaster of emotions that comes with high-stakes espionage. I didn't panic. I simply minimized the encrypted folder and pulled up a digital gallery of baby photos. When Julian shuffled in, squinting against the light and asking why I was still up, I forced my eyes to well with fake, exhausted tears. I can't stop looking at her, Julian, I whispered, my voice trembling with a practiced frailty. He let out a huff of annoyance, muttered something about me being unstable, and went to the kitchen for water. As soon as he was gone, I returned to the abyss. The close call only sharpened my resolve. He thought I was a sentimental fool. He had no idea I was currently liquidating his entire reputation. The breakthrough came just as the sun began to gray the Connecticut horizon. Deep within a hidden subdirectory labeled Maintenance, I found the smoking gun. A final, massive wire transfer for the down payment on the Beaumont's new Hamptons mansion. The source of the funds wasn't Julian's hard-earned bonus or a Beaumont family trust. It was the education fund I had painstakingly built for our daughter, combined with the last of the equity from my premarital apartment. He had used my daughter's future to buy his parents a trophy home. A cold, sharp smile touched my lips, the first real expression of joy I'd felt since the rain. I realized then that the Beaumonts didn't just owe me an apology. They owed me everything. I saved the file to 3 separate encrypted drives and sent a copy to Clara Sterling. As I closed the laptop, I whispered to the empty room, "Transaction invalid. It's time to cancel the entire account." The morning sun crawled across the floor of our Greenwich home, but it felt less like a new beginning and more like the harsh light of a courtroom. I had barely slept, my mind still racing with the digital trail of Julian's theft. Yet I had to transition from the auditor back to the matriarch in mourning. The doorbell rang with a sharp, insistent chime that heralded the arrival of Arthur and Martha Beaumont. They didn't come to offer help or to bond with their granddaughter. They came to conduct a victory lap. Martha swept into the room, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood with the rhythmic arrogance of a woman who believed the world was her private gallery. "Eleanor, dear," she said, her voice dripping with a synthetic sweetness that set my teeth on edge. "You look tired. But I suppose that's the price of motherhood. You really must pull yourself together. Julian's career is at a critical juncture, and he cannot be weighed down by domestic gloom." Julian followed them in, looking refreshed and utterly unbothered by the fact that he had left his wife for dead in the rain just days prior. He stood by the mantel, the very picture of the American dream success story he had spent 15 years faking. Arthur joined him, patting Julian on the back with a heavy hand. "We were just discussing the final touches on the Hamptons estate," Arthur said, his eyes never meeting mine as he accepted a cup of tea. "It's a magnificent legacy for little Lily, of course. We're so pleased you saw a reason regarding the education fund, Eleanor. It's important to remember that in this family, the self-made man is our highest ideal. And sometimes the individual must sacrifice for the greater name." I stood by the sideboard, the invisible observer, playing my part to perfection. I didn't point out that self-made usually implies using one's own money, not siphoning a wife's inheritance and a child's future. I didn't remind them that the American dream was supposed to be built on hard work, not fraud. Instead, I lowered my eyes and smoothed my apron, my fingers surreptitiously checking the recording app on the phone hidden in my pocket. Every word of Arthur's admission about the misappropriated funds was being captured in high fidelity. My internal monologue was a sharp, clinical edit of their dialogue. I was already mentally categorizing this conversation as Exhibit B. "I understand, Arthur," I whispered, my voice carefully calibrated to sound small and compliant. "I only want what's best for Julian and the Beaumont name." Martha leaned back, admiring her reflection in the gilded mirror I had bought for our anniversary. "Good girl," she purred, her condescension so thick it was almost tactile. "Women in our circle often forget that their primary value lies in being a sturdy foundation for their husband's ambitions. Julian is destined for great things, Eleanor. He's the architect of this family's future." Julian beamed, his ego expanding to fill the room. He looked at me not as a partner, but as a piece of furniture that had finally been polished to his satisfaction. He then turned to his parents, his voice brimming with a hollow triumph. "That reminds me," he said. "The board has all but confirmed my promotion to senior partner. We're hosting a grand celebration at the St. Regis in the Hamptons this weekend. It will be the defining moment of my career, the official unveiling of the new Beaumont era." He turned to me, his gaze cold and transactional. "I expect you to be there, Eleanor. Wear that black dress I bought you, the one that makes you look like a partner's wife, not a tired nurse. And please, try to keep the hysterical mother routine to a minimum." I met his eyes, and for the first time in 15 years, I didn't see a husband. I saw a ticking clock. "I wouldn't miss it for the world, Julian," I said, a slow, predatory smile creeping across my face that he misinterpreted as simple devotion. "In fact, I've been preparing a special gift for the occasion, a tribute to everything you've achieved on your own." Julian laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound, and walked toward the nursery without even asking to see the baby. As the Beaumonts began discussing the guest list and the expensive catering, I stood in the kitchen, clutching the phone that held their downfall. Julian had spent his life building a stage for his ego, but I was the one who had written the final act. And as I looked at the red recording light still glowing in my pocket, I knew that when the curtain rose in the Hamptons, the American dream of the Beaumonts was going to end in a very public nightmare. The scent of expensive perfume and cheap arrogance lingered in the hallway long after the Beaumonts had retreated to their own hollow kingdom. I stood in the silent house, the weight of the phone in my pocket feeling like a loaded weapon. My mind was already 3 moves ahead, calculating the impact of Arthur's recorded admission against the forensic trail I had blazed through Julian's digital lies. A few hours later, under the cover of a thick Greenwich fog that felt more like a protective shroud than a cold dampness, I pulled into the parking lot of a quiet, dimly lit cafe on the outskirts of town. Clara Sterling was already there, tucked into a corner booth with a cup of black coffee and the posture of a woman who had spent a lifetime navigating the treacherous currents of New York's elite. She didn't look like a socialite tonight. She looked like a general waiting for a reconnaissance report. I sat down and placed a sleek, encrypted flash drive on the table between us. "It's all here, Clara," I said, my voice steady, devoid of the practiced frailty I showed Julian. "The embezzlement isn't even clever. He's been using a revolving door of shell companies to mask the fact that he's been liquidating the firm's long-term assets to pay for his parents' lifestyle and his own failed margin calls. It's not just creative accounting, it's a felony. He treated the corporate treasury like a personal ATM, and he used my daughter's education fund to cover the paper trail." Clara picked up the drive, her eyes reflecting the dim light of the cafe with a sharp, clinical satisfaction. "My husband has had his suspicions for months," she whispered, leaning in closer. He knew the numbers Julian was reporting didn't align with the market reality, but Julian was always too charming and too well-connected for anyone to dig deeper without a warrant. You've just given him the warrant. As we talked, the air in the cafe seemed to clear, the suffocating fog of the last 15 years finally lifting. For the first time, I wasn't discussing Julian's needs, Julian's career, or the Beaumont legacy. I was discussing data, strategy, and justice with a peer who understood the language of power. I realized then that Julian's greatest mistake wasn't leaving me in the rain. It was assuming that by taking away my title as his wife, he was taking away my value. He had spent years trying to convince me I was a parasite, a dependent who couldn't survive without the Beaumont shield. Yet here I was, the only person in the room with the expertise to dismantle his entire world. I wasn't a victim seeking a settlement. I was a financial editor conducting the final, brutal edit of a fraudulent life. The American dream Julian preached was a fairy tale for the gullible. The reality was this cold, hard table and the receipts that were about to end him. Clara looked at me with a profound sense of solidarity, a look that conveyed more than any words of comfort ever could. We weren't just two women gossiping. We were two architects of a new reality. He's going to walk onto that stage in the Hamptons thinking he's reached the summit, Clara said, her voice laced with a dark, appreciative irony. He has no idea that you've already pulled the pins from the grenades in his pockets. I felt a surge of healing that didn't come from forgiveness, but from the restoration of my own professional dignity. I was no longer the wife of Julian. I was Eleanor Vance, the woman who held the ledger. Clara reached across the table, her hand briefly covering mine. "Are you ready to let the whole of New York see the man behind the mask, Eleanor?" she asked, her gaze unwavering. I took a slow breath, thinking of the rain in Connecticut and the daughter sleeping in her crib. "Not just New York, Clara," I replied with a smile that felt as sharp as a razor. "I want the whole world Julian built on my back to see exactly what happens when the foundation decides to walk away." The St. Regis in the Hamptons glittered with the kind of aggressive, blinding opulence that the Beaumonts considered their natural habitat. The air was thick with the scent of overpriced lilies and the metallic tang of salt from the Atlantic, a sensory backdrop for a crowd that measured human worth in zip codes and portfolio growth. Julian stood at the center of the ballroom, his silhouette sharp in a tuxedo that probably cost more than a year of state college tuition, holding a glass of vintage Cristal as if it were a scepter. He was the self-made king of the night, basking in the glow of cameras and the sycophantic laughter of the board members he had spent years deceiving. To him, the room was a mirror reflecting his own manufactured greatness, a final validation of the American dream he had supposedly conquered. He didn't see the fractures in the foundation. He only saw the shimmer of the gold leaf he'd used to cover the rot. I moved through the crowd with the silence of the abyss, a ghost in a minimalist black silk dress that felt less like evening wear and more like armor. Julian had wanted a background accessory, a docile wife to stand 3 paces behind him and smile at the right intervals, and I was giving him exactly what he asked for, or so he thought. He had barely looked at me since we arrived, dismissively patting my hand as if I were a well-behaved pet. "Try not to look so maternal tonight, Eleanor," he had whispered earlier, his voice carrying that sharp, patronizing edge. "Tonight is about the Beaumont legacy, not your domestic sentiments." I had simply nodded, my internal monologue a dry, clinical audit of his impending doom. Every flash of a photographer's bulb was a countdown. Every congratulatory handshake Julian accepted was another liability added to a ledger he no longer controlled. Martha and Arthur Beaumont were positioned near the stage, acting as the regents of this hollow empire, preening for the local society reporters about the values of hard work they had instilled in their son. They spoke of the new villa as if it were a family heritage passed down through generations, conveniently omitting the fact that it was built on the liquidated ruins of my daughter's future. I watched them with a terrifying, absolute stillness. There was no anger left, only the cold, surgical precision of a professional about to execute a necessary write-off. The audience of wealthy peers, the very people the Beaumonts desperately wanted to impress, were all present, their expectations high and their attention focused on the man of the hour. It was a perfect, slow reveal setting, a beautiful, shimmering stage for a very public execution. The lights dimmed, and the low hum of conversation died down as the chairman stepped to the microphone to introduce Julian for his keynote address on the self-made path, integrity and innovation. The irony was so sharp, it felt like a physical weight in the room. Julian smoothed his jacket, flashed his most charismatic, fraudulent smile, and began his ascent to the stage. He looked back at me for a split second, a flicker of triumph in his eyes, as if to say, "See, I didn't need you after all." I stood in the deep shadows near the tech booth, my fingers steady as they brushed the surface of the tablet tucked into my clutch. I wasn't the hysterical woman he'd left in the rain anymore. I was the auditor, and the time for his final report had arrived. As Julian reached the podium and the screen behind him prepared to flicker to life, I felt the breath of a coming storm fill the ballroom. "Enjoy the spotlight while it lasts, Julian," I whispered into the darkness. "Because I'm about to show everyone exactly how much integrity costs when you're spending someone else's life." Julian stood at the podium, his chest expanded with a hollow pride that had been fueled by 15 years of my silent labor. "Success," he declared, his voice projected with a calculated Ivy League resonance, "is not inherited. It is forged in the fires of personal responsibility and the relentless pursuit of the American dream." He paused for dramatic effect, gesturing toward the massive LED screen behind him, expecting a montage of his corporate triumphs. But I had already bypassed the hotel's security protocols. Instead of the polished video of his corporate victories, the screen flickered and then roared to life with the grainy, high-definition footage from a Mercedes dashboard camera. The ballroom fell into a sudden, suffocating silence as the speakers broadcast the sound of lashing rain and a woman's guttural cry of pain. The elite of New York watched, frozen in their velvet chairs, as the Julian on screen, vicious and unmasked, hauled his pregnant wife out into the Connecticut mud. "Get out, Eleanor! I am not ruining these seats for your drama!" his recorded voice hissed, the cruelty stripped of its boardroom polish. The visual of the designer diaper bag being tossed into the filth was the punctuation mark on his integrity. Julian froze, his face draining of color until he looked like a marble statue of a man who had already passed away. But I wasn't finished. With a single swipe on my tablet, the footage dissolved into a series of bright, red-inked financial ledgers, the receipts of his true career. The screen displayed a forensic breakdown of the $50,000 family gifts, the forged signatures on my inheritance waivers, and the systematic embezzlement of firm assets to fund the Beaumont's new Hamptons villa. I stepped out from the shadows of the tech booth, the silence of the abyss now replaced by the razor-sharp clarity of a lead auditor. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as I walked toward the stage, my heels clicking a steady, rhythmic beat against the marble. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I spoke with a quiet, lethal precision that carried to the very back of the hall. "You spoke of self-reliance, Julian," I said, my voice as cold as the rain he'd left me in. "But your entire portfolio is built on subprime lies and stolen equity. You didn't build a legacy. You managed a pyramid scheme where I was the only real asset." I looked at the board members, their faces twisted in a mixture of horror and professional disgust. "The reports you've been signing for 3 years? I wrote the truth. He edited the fraud." Julian's mouth worked, but no sound came out. He looked toward his parents, but Arthur and Martha were busy trying to shield their faces from the sudden flurry of smartphone cameras, their self-made masks shattered beyond repair. The American dream they had preached was being liquidated in real time, and the interest on their debt had finally come due. I turned back to Julian, who was now trembling, the self-proclaimed shark reduced to a cornered pilot fish. "You told me I was a liability, Julian," I whispered, loud enough for the microphone to catch every syllable. "But in the world of finance, the most dangerous thing you can do is underestimate the woman who keeps your books." The climax reached its peak as Clara Sterling stepped onto the stage, her presence commanding an immediate, funereal silence. She didn't look at Julian. She looked through him, as if he were a clerical error that needed to be erased. "The board has seen enough, Mr. Beaumont," she said, her voice a gavel strike. "Your security clearance is revoked. Your accounts are frozen, and the firm will be cooperating fully with the federal authorities regarding the misappropriation of these funds." As the first murmurs of the scandal began to ripple through the room like a tidal wave, I walked off the stage without looking back. Julian was standing in the center of the spotlight he had craved, but he was finally realizing that the light doesn't just show your success, it reveals your rot. The glittering lights of the St. Regis Ballroom didn't fade into a celebratory toast. They were replaced by the harsh, strobing blue and red of federal escort vehicles. The self-made man didn't leave the stage to a standing ovation, but with the rhythmic, metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut over his expensive French cuffs. I stood by the grand entrance, my daughter asleep in her carrier, and watched as the FBI agents led Julian through a gauntlet of his peers, the very people he had spent 15 years trying to impress with a life he had stolen from me. There was no screaming, no dramatic struggle, just the heavy, clinical silence of a hostile takeover finally reaching its conclusion. Arthur and Martha Beaumont were left huddled near the buffet, their legacy reduced to a series of frantic phone calls to lawyers who, quite frankly, weren't going to answer for a family whose assets were currently being frozen by the Department of Justice. The aftermath was a masterclass in forensic purification. Within 48 hours, the bank had initiated the seizure of the Beaumont's new Hamptons villa. It turns out that when a house is purchased with a combination of embezzled corporate funds and a siphoned off inheritance from a non-consenting spouse, the American dream becomes a government asset almost overnight. I didn't feel a surge of vengeful joy as I watched the news reports of their eviction. I felt a profound sense of self-reliance that they had never truly understood. I had filed for divorce the morning after the gala, a document that wasn't just a legal separation, but a final, binding audit. Because of the receipts I had meticulously gathered, the court didn't just grant me a settlement. It ordered the immediate restoration of my original inheritance and the full replenishment of my daughter's education fund from Julian's remaining liquidated accounts. I returned to our Greenwich house one last time, not as the invisible observer, but as the owner of the ledger. The high-ceilinged rooms that once felt like a golden cage now just felt like empty space waiting for a better tenant. I moved through the house with a silence of the abyss that had been transformed into a quiet, unwavering peace. I packed only what belonged to me and Lily, the books, the photos, and the professional dignity I had reclaimed. I didn't take a single piece of furniture Julian had bought with his cooked bonuses. I didn't want the scent of his fraud in my new life. As I locked the front door for the final time, I realized that I wasn't leaving behind a marriage. I was finishing a total loss write-off. I was finally free from the debt of a man who had never intended to pay me back in anything but lies. A week later, while I was organizing my new, sun-drenched apartment in the city, my phone buzzed with a restricted number. It was Julian, calling from a pre-trial detention center. His voice was stripped of its boardroom arrogance, replaced by a pathetic, whining desperation that I had seen many times in the self-made drafts he used to bring home. "Eleanor, you have to help me," he stammered, his words tripping over each other. "The lawyers say I'm looking at 10 years. My parents are in a motel, Eleanor. Think about the legacy. Think about what people will say about Lily's father. Just tell the board it was a mistake. Tell them you helped me with the books. We can start over. I'll make it up to you, I swear." I sat down on a packing crate, looking at my daughter who was peacefully playing with a wooden block on the rug. The American dream Julian was offering was a bankrupt currency, and I was no longer a buyer. I didn't feel anger, and I certainly didn't feel the hysteria he had accused me of in the rain. I felt the absolute cold clarity of a professional who had finally balanced the accounts. "Julian," I said, my voice as calm as a summer morning, "you spent 15 years telling me I didn't understand the real market. You were right. I finally understand that some assets are just too toxic to keep on the books." He started to protest, but I cut him off with the finality of a closing bell. "I didn't destroy your legacy, Julian. You liquidated it the moment you pushed me out of that car. I'm not your editor anymore. I've already closed this account." I pressed the end call button and set the phone down, the silence of the room feeling like the most beautiful symphony I had ever heard. 1 year has passed since the storm in Connecticut, and the air in my New York apartment today is nothing like the suffocating, expensive silence of Greenwich. The floor-to-ceiling windows of my new home in the city catch the morning light, illuminating a space that I bought with my own restored inheritance and the first significant bonuses from my new firm, Vance Financial Consulting. I no longer spend my nights editing the fraudulent drafts of a man who viewed me as a liability. Instead, I spend them helping other women. Women who, like me, were told they didn't understand the real market, to audit their lives and reclaim their financial sovereignty. The American dream I once chased alongside Julian was a fragile thing, a trophy house built on sand and stolen equity. Today, my dream is grounded in a new balance sheet, one where the primary assets are integrity, professional respect, and the fierce independence of a woman who finally knows her own market value. The doorbell chimes and I welcome Clara Sterling into my office. We aren't meeting under a gas station overhang or in a hospital room anymore. We are meeting as business partners. Clara has become a regular fixture in my new life, a testament to the female solidarity that Julian's world tried to tell us was impossible. We are currently collaborating on a foundation that provides forensic accounting services to domestic abuse survivors, ensuring that no woman is ever left bankrupt by a partner's greed again. As we sit at the table, reviewing the quarterly projections for our new project, I realize that the intellectual satisfaction I felt during the audit in the shadows wasn't just about revenge. It was the rebirth of a career I had foolishly suppressed for 15 years. I am no longer an invisible observer. I am the lead strategist of my own life. Clara glances at the morning paper on my desk, where a small headline mentions the final sentencing for the Beaumont fraud case. Julian is serving his time, and his parents have retreated to a small, rented apartment in Florida, far from the Hampton circles they once craved. I don't feel a surge of triumph when I see his name. Instead, I feel a quiet, distant pity, the kind of humanized compassion you feel for a poorly managed asset that was destined for liquidation from the start. Julian wasn't a shark. He was just a man who didn't realize that a legacy built on lies is simply a debt that eventually comes due. I've long since closed that account, and I don't carry the interest of his betrayal into my future. Later that afternoon, I take my daughter Lily to Central Park. She is taking those first brave steps across the vibrant green grass, her laughter a bright, defiant sound against the hum of the city. I watch her and realize that the most important inheritance I will ever leave her isn't the money Julian tried to steal, nor is it the Beaumont name he tried to tarnish. It is the American dream of self-reliance and the knowledge that her worth is never determined by the person sitting in the driver's seat. I've built a real legacy, founded on the dignity of a woman who stood up in the rain and decided she was worth more than a leather seat in a stolen car. As Lily reaches my outstretched arms, I look up at the New York skyline and smile. The books are balanced, the audit is complete, and for the first time in my life, I am exactly where I am supposed to be. In the world of finance, we talk about assets and liabilities. For a long time, I thought I was an asset to Julian's life, only to realize I was just a resource he planned to deplete. But the most valuable thing I ever owned wasn't the money in the bank. It was my voice and my truth. To anyone listening who feels like a discarded item, remember, you are the auditor of your own worth. Don't let anyone write your story in red ink. How do you feel about my journey? Have you ever had to find the courage to stand up for yourself when everyone else expected you to stay silent? I'd love to hear your thoughts and lessons in the comments. Please like this video, share it with someone who needs to find their strength today, and don't forget to subscribe. Your support means the world to me and my little one. Thank you for listening to my story.